Hi again. In The Rise of Adventism, Edwin Scott Gaustad, editor, Robert V. Hine wrote the 5th chapter, Communitarianism. In this section, he's dealing with the community that came to be known best as the Oneida Community. What Mother Ann Lee was to the Shakers, John Humphrey Noyes was to Oneida, possibly the most interesting of all 19th century American utopias. He was a storekeeper's son in the village of Putney, Vermont. A thorough New Englander, he attended Dartmouth College and early espoused the pragmatic belief that morals were relative to their context. His conversion came at a revival meeting in 1831 when he was 24 years old. Henceforth, religion dominated his life. He went to Andover Theological Seminary, but soon found it was not to his liking and moved to Yale, a more liberal atmosphere. He was licensed to preach, but his ideas grew more liberal even than Yale's, and his license was revoked. Noyes fell into despair, and what followed might be called his 40 days in the wilderness. His desert was New York City, and Noyes wandered like a lost soul, tortured, drinking, choked with rebellious feelings. Gathering the poor and outcast around him, he began to develop his ideas to be known as perfectionism. He rejected original sin, believing redemption immediately available to men through the presence of Christ. The kingdom was here and now. Man needed only to accept it to become perfect. Perfection was demonstrated by a lifestyle which was both a method and an outward sign, the practice of brotherhood in community. In 1846, his withdrawal over, Noyes returned to Putney and drew a few faithful followers into a utopian community. He called for spiritual equality, which meant, among other things, equality between the sexes. Members were to share their worldly belongings as proof of unselfishness. The primitive Christian church was their model, but the outside society saw Noyes' colony as anything but Christian. In 1847, the leader was arrested for adultery. Noyes knew he could not continue in his native town. Forfeiting bail, he fled westward to upstate New York, that fabulous area of religious fervor. Only a few miles from the birthplace or centers of Adventism, the Millerites, the Shakers, the Mormons, and the Spiritualists, Noyes set up his colony, the perfectionists called Oneida. The community persisted through triumph and tribulations from 1848 to 1879. Oneida's experiment in complex marriage and genetics has been labeled the most revolutionary of all American marriage systems. Complex marriage assumed that the nuptial covenant was between each individual and every other individual in the group. According to Noyes, monogamous marriage institutionalized selfishness and tyranny and stood directly in the path of Christ's injunction to love all one's neighbors as oneself. Furthermore, a woman's lot should not be restricted to childbirth and its implications, but should be a full life involved with the entire society. One way to free women, he felt, was through birth control, in which the man took the responsibility for preventing conception. The method seemed to him easy and natural and was only dangerous if the rowers got too near the waterfall. Self-control will always be, he said, man's greatest glory. Noyes himself practiced the system for 2 years before its promulgation. In contrast to the 5 childbirths of his wife in the prior years, during the 2 years of his personal experiment, no children were conceived. In its proper place, sex was to be enjoyed by all, the woman as well as the man. Shame at sex was, according to Noyes, shame of God's handiwork. In teaching young men the method of birth control, the community encouraged them to have relations at first with older women beyond the menopause. In spite of its complications, the system worked fairly well, since the records show only 13 unplanned conceptions in the 10 years, 1869 to 1879. Oneida further experimented with eugenics in a system which Noyes called Stirpiculture. The community hoped to improve its offspring by allowing only the best people to conceive. Members applied to a committee if they wished to have children. Other marriages, about 1/4 of the total, were initiated by the committee itself. In the 10 years following 1869, 58 live children were born, 10 of them sired by Noyes. The children were raised together in a separate house, and their schooling was similar to that received by prosperous middle-class outsiders. They were reared by men as much as by women, but emotional attachments to individuals were avoided. Some of the boys were sent to Yale. The statistical results were impressive. The group was healthier, long-lived, and emotionally adjusted. Work at Oneida, as far as can be judged from its products and successful commerce with the outside world, was a confident expression of its community or communal ideals. Sewell Newhouse, one of the members, invented a superior steel trap, which became a nationally known product, especially on the frontier. As with the Shakers, labor-saving devices were constantly being improved. Oneidans were particularly proud of their dishwasher and bean slicer. They also took advantage of inventions from the outside world. They were, for example, among the first to realize the benefits of sewing machines. Women engaged in all the work of the community, and partly because of this, they dressed inventively. Most of the day they wore long pants under their short skirts. They cut their hair close. These practical signs of liberation, both useful and symbolic, were among the most violently denounced aspects of Oneida life, as seen by its growing army of hostile outsiders. Visitors on several occasions, however, noted that the women at Oneida looked younger and healthier than the general population. For both sexes, efforts abounded to minimize drudgery. Everyone took his share of the dirty work on a rotating basis. Rotation was a desirable principle in itself to avoid monotony and tedium. It also retarded specialization, a barrier between people and a disruptor of community. At Oneida, all jobs were programmed to be pleasurable. When possible, readers were assigned to enlighten and entertain the workers. Members studied to improve their work. The library numbered 4,000 volumes. Intellectual currents ran high. Members were intrigued, for example, with experiments in the power of mind over disease, though they always kept their doctor nearby. Dancing and card-playing were encouraged. An orchestra and a theatrical group performed so well that audiences came from miles around. Gilbert and Sullivan operettas were among their favorites. Oneida lived out its experiment for 30 years, more than a generation. External hostility increased, however, as the reputation of the community grew. The members recalled constant hostility. The boys, if away from the community, were taunted as Christ boys, or more difficult to take, if no less accurate, bastards. These, of course, only mirrored a deeper dislike engendered by the threat to a competitive, individualistic, and monogamous society. The churches, led by Presbyterians, mounted the final assault, taking their case to the state capitol in efforts to outlaw Oneida. Curiously, complex marriage, unlike polygamy with the Mormons, was never tested in the courts. Nevertheless, Noyes felt so insecure that he temporarily left for Canada. In 1879, the community in turn protected itself by becoming a joint stock company. The earlier ideals were irretrievably diluted. The Shakers and Oneida say much to our day, but in their own time they were overshadowed by a large variety of communes. The dramatic effort of Robert Owen to transport the lessons he had learned in his Scottish factory town to frontier Indiana was over by 1826. Yet it encouraged others, including Francis Wright's Nashoba colony for freed black slaves. In the 1840s, the doctrines of Charles Fourier, at the same time zany and profound, spawned dozens of communes from Brook Farm to Massachusetts, west of Wisconsin and south to Texas. Altogether, there were nearly 100 utopian experiments before the Civil War, and a dozen of them lasted for a generation or so each. 19th century communes, in common, found the prevailing society to be inefficient, corrupt, or evil. They rejected the chaos and inhumanity of the competitive society in favor of a more loving, humane model nurtured in cooperation. Provided the right entertainment, men could achieve perfection. Individuals could relate to, provided the right environment, men could achieve perfection. Individuals could relate to a natural, universal harmony, and in doing so, could engineer a better society. The values of order and efficiency could be allied to those of brotherhood. Sharing emphasized the oneness of life. Anything which caused cleavages in the group must be avoided, whether it be marriage, private property, or the competitive capitalist economy. Work should be purposeful. People should live integrated lives with work. Play and spirituality only parts of one whole experience. Experimentation was essential, provided the primary importance of the group over the individual was recognized. The result would be a better society and a cooperative person at peace with himself and his world. A glance at the modern commune movement may throw some light on the earlier phases. At any one time in America from 1967 to 1972, between 2,000 and 3,000 communes existed, with 10,000 to 40,000 people involved. These groups varied enormously, but some few ideas seem to be general. They now spring from affluence, and their concerns are more with the quality of life than with efficiency of production. In response to a bureaucratic and impersonal world, they avoid structure. They often seek non-rational experience like occultism, and they have created a far freer sexual atmosphere. Yet for all the differences, the direction of the commune movement, the disavowal of the competitive life for the harmonic, cooperative, integrated society, remains fundamental. The modern commune movement and 19th century communitarianism must finally be judged as parts of one long historical movement. If a century and a half seems long for such a movement, it may be helpful to compare the early Christian communes in the first centuries after Christ. Christians then drew together, searching for the sacredness and totality of life in ideal community. Experiment after experiment failed, regrouped, and tried again. In the 4th and 5th centuries, this communitarian impulse sparked the beginnings of monasticism, as groups of men withdrew from the prevailing society into wilderness or frontier areas, hoping to recreate the earlier sense of Christian community. They too continually broke apart and tried again. Eventually, St. Benedict collected the wisdom of that experience and codified it in the Benedictine rule, but the road had been long. Viewed in another way, the commune movement may be an extension of late 18th and early 19th century Romanticism. Romantics sought to reinstate non-intellectual powers, along with the mystery of life, the full expression of a total human experience, and even social revolution, as with Byron fighting for Greek independence. They glorified the restlessness, idealism, and rebelliousness of youth. Presumably, Romanticism was buried under late 19th century science and industrialism. These ideas may have been submerged, but only for a while, to re-emerge in our time. This is 1974. Thus, over a 200-year span, tens of thousands of Americans have gathered in thousands of communes, seeking alternatives to the prevailing society, more complete human involvement in the brotherhood of man. The moral values they have sought have often been lost in the industrialized society. Their renaissance thus appears to be revolutionary, though it is in fact old, traditional, and a common inheritance from the communitarianism and utopianism of mid-19th century America. Next chapter is spiritualism. Put in a link to destructive religious groups, because out of the commune movement of the early 1970s came, of course, several of the most destructive cults of the last 50 years. So our 3 videos linked together on destructive religious groups and how you can identify them.